August 19, 1944. The German generals didn't fear the Americans. They laughed at them. They said the US Army couldn't fight without its trucks, couldn't move without its fuel, and couldn't win without its machines. To them, the Americans were soft, spoiled by abundance, dependent on gasoline and luck. But they were wrong, because when Patton's tanks ran dry on the road to Germany, a miracle began to roll, a roaring river of steel and courage that turned the tide of war. It was called into the Red Ball Express, and it would prove that in modern war that the real weapon isn't the gun, it's the supply line. To them, the US Army was a patchwork of inexperienced men, shiny equipment, and chaos disguised as confidence. The Germans had spent years perfecting the art of logistics. Their blitzkrieg was as much about fuel and planning as tanks and tactics. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, the Germans weren't just waiting with guns. They were waiting with doubt. They believed the Americans would collapse under the weight of their own supplies. It seemed they were right. As the Allies pushed inland, supply ships struggled to unload. Roads turned to mud. But behind those supply delays, something extraordinary was brewing, an idea that would defy every rule of warfare, every expectation of efficiency, and every smug German grin. The Americans were about to turn logistics into a weapon. The D-Day landings were a triumph of courage, but what came after was a nightmare of math. By late summer 1944, the Allies had achieved the impossible. They had broken through Normandy against hedgerows and were racing toward Germany. But there was a problem. Every mile forward meant another mile away from the ports that fed the army. Fuel was the blood of mechanized war. Every Sherman tank gulped nearly 2 gallons per mile. Trucks consumed more just carrying supplies forward. Soon ammunition and fuel convoys were crawling through ruined towns and bombed-out bridges, burning more gas than they delivered. Patton's Third Army, the spearhead of the Allied advance, was unstoppable in battle but immobilized in logistics. His tanks stood silent, not from enemy fire, but from empty tanks. They were right for now. But inside the Allied command, panic gave birth to invention. Commanders realized the only way forward was to build a moving lifeline, a rolling artery of steel and sweat that never stopped. The plan was insane, and that's why it worked. His armored divisions, the pride of the US Army, were stranded in open fields, their mighty engines quiet. Crews sat on turret tops waiting for fuel that never came. Every decision became a gamble. Which division would get the next convoy? Which battle would have to wait? Soldiers joked grimly that Patton's army had run out of gas halfway to Berlin. But Patton wasn't a man who waited for miracles. He demanded them. And his logisticians, men few historians ever name, answered. They proposed a bold, almost reckless plan. Dedicate an entire network of trucks, roads and drivers to fuel the front. A single non-stop artery from Normandy to the front line, running day and night, protected by nothing but speed and willpower. They called it the Red Ball Express. In just days, over 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, were organized into the most daring logistical operation of the war. The name Red Ball came from old railroad slang, meaning priority freight. And that is exactly what it was, a high-speed lifeline that couldn't stop for anything. Roads were marked with red circles, guarded by military police and forbidden to civilian traffic. Trucks ran bumper to bumper, 24 hours a day. The drivers, mostly young, mostly African-American, faced rain, darkness, and Luftwaffe attacks. They drove through fire, exhaustion, and fear. Accidents were common. Each driver knew one thing: if they stopped, the army stopped. And soon the Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply route. They weren't celebrated. They weren't even treated as equals. Over. 75% of the Red Ball drivers were African-American soldiers, men serving a country that still segregated them. They slept in their trucks, ate cold rations, and faced prejudice even as they fueled victory. But on those roads, under fire and under pressure, they became heroes. They learned to fix their own engines with scavenged parts, to drive on instinct, to navigate by moonlight. One driver later recalled, "You didn't have time to be scared. You just prayed the next bend wasn't the last." By the time the operation ended, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, everything an army needed to keep fighting. Those men didn't just drive trucks, they drove history. Every truckload meant another shell fired, another tank rolling, another step toward victory. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't glorious, but it was essential. In the end, logistics, not tanks or tactics, decided who won. Patton's divisions were back on the move, slicing through France at a pace no one thought possible. Behind every victory, behind every German retreat, was a driver gripping a wheel, eyes burning with fatigue, knowing one thing: if he failed, others would die. War historians later called the Red Ball Express the engine of victory, but for those who lived it, it was more than history. It was survival, duty, and determination fused with steel. By autumn 1944, the laughter in German war rooms had stopped. Their intelligence officers couldn't understand how the Americans were moving so fast, so far, with so much. Oh, the secret wasn't a new weapon, it was willpower on wheels. The Red Ball Express turned ridicule into respect. The same generals who once mocked American chaos now faced its power, a machine that never slept, never stopped, and never gave up. When Allied tanks finally crossed into Germany, they did so on a road paved not just by engineers, but by truck drivers who refused to quit. The Red Ball Express faded after victory, replaced by new systems and new wars. But its spirit endures. In every military convoy, every logistical chain, every soldier who understands that wars are not won by those who fight hardest, but by those who keep them moving. This was the story of the Red Ball Express, the supply line that silenced German laughter and fueled Allied victory. If you enjoyed this untold story of courage and ingenuity, make sure to unsubscribe for more hidden histories of war, love, and humanity. Where ordinary people change the course of history, one impossible act at a time,